So my presentation is a little bit different, and I am in a Ian Davis sandwich, I think, in this session. And I'm talking about some innovation, harking back to Chris's keynote earlier, where we identified that we really wanted to look at how students were engaging with their assessment feedback and ways to try and make it a little bit more dialogic and interactive, really. So this was a project that I led, but very much collaborated and co-created with colleagues over in psychology, and also two student researchers who were involved throughout the project, from planning it through to the evaluation phase. Okay, so if we just think about assessment feedback within higher education, it's something you're both very familiar with, but there's a huge amount of literature written about assessment feedback and the importance of assessment feedback. And initially, historically, that literature has focused on how influential that process of assessment feedback is in terms of students' learning and attainment. More recently, the dialogue around this has shifted slightly, and it's actually, rather than just looking at the processes of assessment feedback, what we really need to look at is students' engagement with that assessment feedback, because it's what students do with the feedback that they are receiving on assessments that's actually impacting the learning and the attainment. And this was increasing comments within the literature that feedback shouldn't be just seen as something that happens at the end of the module and that there's no dialogue about it. Instead, it needs to be something where it was part of a conversation. That obviously presents some challenges, particularly within relatively large courses. And there's been various innovations, things people have done, such as looking at audio feedback, video feedback, etc., and ways to try and address this and increase the amount of dialogue. We chose to focus on something a little bit different. We'd relied heavily on providing written feedback, students reading that feedback hopefully and engaging with it. So what we wanted to look at, and what the students were telling us, is that actually the feedback they got, they found it quite helpful, but they didn't always understand it. And it was those instances where they didn't understand it that they wanted this opportunity for dialogue. So we looked in the literature to see what other people had done in terms of trying to improve this process and make it more dialogic. And there was a number of research studies that had looked at developing what they kind of coined as interactive cover sheets. So when students submitted work for assessment, there was a cover sheet in which they could ask the marker something or initiate some of that dialogue. So rather than it just being the students submitted their work and the markers responded to that, there was something else coming from the student. And we found 3 research studies that had previously trialled this. The first 2, Bloxman and Campbell and Rodway, had trialled this in very small courses with small cohorts of about 20 students. And both their interactive cover sheets focused very much on asking the students if there was anything in particular they'd like the marker to give them feedback on. So that the student was influencing the content a little bit more of the written feedback that they received, rather than it just being their work that influenced the content of that feedback. The final one, Crowler et al., was a slightly different study in which they gave some students a cover sheet, which again just had a basic question of, is there something you'd like the marker to comment on? And then they had a control group where they didn't give the students a cover sheet and they looked at their satisfaction. Whereas Bloxman, Campbell and Rodway had found very positive outcomes for using the cover sheet, and Crowler et al. Hadn't found such positive outcomes. Now, what we wanted to do was try and look at what had been done in the past, but also look at our current practice and what we could do to improve it. So we used the model of research that is an action research project, which we had 3 distinct phases of. Firstly, evaluating our current practice. Secondly, developing our practice, developing a new cover sheet, and then evaluating that new cover sheet. So we were sticking very much with that overarching goal, really, of developing the cover sheet that we were already using, that was based on some of the research that I've already mentioned. But really what we wanted to do was to promote dialogue and reflection within the feedback process, as we saw those as being sort of good measures, basically, of student engagement. Just to give you a tiny bit of context, obviously we're here at Staffs, and within psychology we have approximately 500 undergraduate students across the 3 years. They are spread across 5 different degrees, but a lot of the courses, a lot of the modules they take are similar. So we often are dealing with cohorts of around 150 to 200 students in one module. The students are taught by quite a large staff group of about 30 members of staff. We have a lot of postgraduate courses, so many of those staff are also teaching on postgraduate courses as well. This just provides that context that, yeah, we've got a large cohort, but we've also got quite a large staff body, but quite a disparate staff body that's spread across a lot of courses. So sometimes getting consistency can be a little bit of a challenge. In terms of our assessment and feedback practices at the beginning of this project, they were already fairly positively evaluated by our external examinators, who commented in their annual reports about the detailed constructive feedback that we gave to students, and the other kind of external measure of the NSS feedback and assessment score. So in 2020, before this project started, we were already getting 80% for assessment and feedback. So we were meeting that university target, and also assessment and feedback tends to be that one that throughout institutions struggle with. In terms of our practices within psychology, we use Turnitin for all the work to be submitted, and we use the feedback studio within Turnitin to give the student feedback. So it is predominantly summary comments and comments on the students' work that they have submitted. So our existing practice that we used prior to this was that students, when submitting their work, had a cover sheet in which, you know, all the normal stuff about word counts and student number and things, but we also had an additional section where we asked students, what would you particularly like the marker to comment or give feedback on? So this was very much following kind of the practices that had been outlined in the literature before as having potential to promote dialogue. We also had a consistent way throughout our undergraduate courses in all the modules, where we structured the feedback by telling the student who the marker was, 3 strengths, and then 3 suggestions or areas for improvement, and then the answer to the cover sheet question. So this is what we were already doing. So our first step with this was to evaluate what we were already doing, and we did this by asking all of our 2nd and 3rd years, so the students, this was done in the autumn, so it was students who'd already studied with us previously, were returning students, and we wanted to know what their experiences had been to that point in their degree. So all 2nd and 3rd years. We've got a relatively small sample size, 53 of the students completed the survey, and they were relatively engaged students, as you might imagine. So we'd ask them sort of some questions, background demographics, and how engaged they thought they were, etc. So we know that it is a slightly biased sample. We had some questions that we were suggesting we might include on the cover sheet, and we asked them to rank those questions in terms of which ones they thought would be most useful to include on the cover sheet. And then we had some open-ended questions about what they liked, what they didn't like, how they thought we could improve. So the top ranked questions is that students suggested that they would like to be asked on the cover sheet, what have you tried to improve in this assignment based on previous feedback? You can tell these were engaged students. They were already very much on board with this idea that we were trying to promote, that feedback doesn't just relate to what happens in that module. Feedback is feed forward. We want them to go on and use it. So they were very much already picking up on that. But it really did come from the students that, yes, they were engaged a bunch who opted to complete our questionnaire, but they clearly recognised that having that opportunity to use feedback from one assessment to another was important, and they wanted to tell us what they tried to do so that we could then give them feedback on whether they were going in the right direction, etc. And then they also liked the idea of having this question of what would you like feedback on so that you can improve your work in the future. So again, these students were obviously looking for that feed forward type of feedback. The questions they didn't want on were quite interesting. So the questions that we also included were things about what they thought the strengths or what they thought the weaknesses were of their assignments. They didn't really rate those. But interestingly, in the open-ended questions, a lot of the students said, actually, it's fine as it is, leave it as it is. Quite a few students thought that it would be useful to tell us what it was that they had struggled with in preparing the assessment. They didn't really explain why, and this seemed a little bit opposite maybe. So they didn't want to tell us what they thought the weaknesses of their work were. And you can think of all sorts of reasons which make lots of sense. They might want to draw our attention to those, but they did seem to want to tell us what they found challenging or what they struggled with. And there was quite a lot of feedback about, I don't really understand what the cover sheet's for. I don't really know, do I have to fill in that question? Is it compulsory? Is it optional? And very much a feeling that we needed to embed it more within our teaching so that they knew what to expect and having had some guidance about how best to use the cover sheet. Okay, so that's where kind of our evaluation came from. And then working together with my colleagues and also the student researchers on the project, we then worked to develop the new cover sheet. So rather than me telling you about this, one of our student researchers, Leonie, is going to tell you about it. Assuming it all plays. Okay, that's terribly echoey for me. I hope it was all right for you, but sometimes it's nice. This was a video that Leonie created for us to help introduce the cover sheets to students as well. So it's rather small up there, but this is basically the cover sheet that we then innovated as part of this project. And you can see that we've very much followed those suggestions from the students. We've asked that question about what have you worked on based on previous feedback in preparing this assignment. We've asked that question about what it is that they found challenging in preparing this assignment, and then that very open-ended question about what is it that they particularly like the marker to comment on or give feedback on. So this was the new cover sheet that we then used for all assessments from the autumn of 2020. And so students had that opportunity to complete it, submit it with their assignments at the end of semester 1 and again for semester 2. And so we did then a number of ways of looking at kind of evaluating how well this new cover sheet had worked. And what we found is that when we compared the use of the cover sheet in summer 2021, so the new cover sheet compared to the old cover sheet in 2020, my dates don't add up on this, do they? But I know what I mean, but I think my dates are horrific. Apologies for that. Basically, you can see that for level 4 students, not very many had used it the previous year, and then lots had used it. Almost 100% had used the new cover sheet, and similarly with level 5, although more had used it previously, again, the uptake of the new cover sheet for the new academic year was significantly better. So students are using it, one measure of success. But of course, what are students' experiences? What do they like about it? What do they not like about it? So we carried out a number of focus groups with students, and we really tried with these to invite students, encourage students to take part through word of mouth, so that we didn't just get the very engaged students. We tried to get a really representative, diverse sample of our students across the 3 years of the undergraduate degree courses as well. We carried out a thematic analysis on the responses that came up at the focus group, and a number of things came up. Firstly, students found the cover sheet a little bit hard. It took time. It was another thing that they had to do before they could submit their work, and that they felt that they'd be able to do it better if there was a time interval, if they submitted their work and then submitted the cover sheet, let's say a week later, which we thought was interesting. As often happens when you get students talking about feedback, they want to tell you about the sorts of feedback that they would really like, that they value. And students very much echoed what we already know from the literature, that they would like specific and detailed feedback. When it came to interaction and that goal that we had to try and create a dialogue, they didn't really feel that the feedback sheet was fully achieving that. They wanted still something that was more interactive. They felt, just answering these questions, writing the answers wasn't really an interaction. They really value verbal conversations, and they certainly, just some interesting things came up in the focus groups. There's little things like we'd always put our initials, first marker, SR, Sarah Rose. Everybody knows who SR is, don't they? No, students hated us putting the initials because they said that they had no clue who marked their work. So that was a very small, easy change that we were able to make, but it was something really clear that came up in this focus group. Also, students in the focus group talked a lot about, I didn't know you could speak to the person who'd marked your work. And again, we'd assumed that they knew that, that door was open, the email was open, etc. So it was some really useful things that came up about actually what little things that we could do that weren't directly related to the cover sheet, but might help promote this dialogue. And then, harking back to your presentation really as well, Ian, students are all individuals, and one size doesn't fit all. What one student liked, another student didn't like, but they also felt that maybe the cover sheet needs to be different for different modules. They also felt the cover sheet should be optional. It kind of was optional, but they were under the impression that some of them, that it might be compulsory and that their work wouldn't be marked if they didn't fill it in. So a little bit of confusion around. As well as finding out from students their experiences, we also wanted to find out staff's experiences of the feedback. So again, this is data that we collected last summer. Staff also thought the feedback sheet, cover sheet, should be optional. The students shouldn't have to fill it in. They did think that we needed to do more in terms of introducing it to students earlier, and that students sometimes struggled to complete it in a meaningful way. That they what would you like feedback on? Everything. What did you struggle with? Everything. And that maybe a little bit more coaching through academic mentoring, etc., about the sorts of things that could be asked on it might be helpful. And staff talked about workload implications that they felt when they were marking. They'd turn over, this one hasn't filled in the cover sheet. A little bit of time I can save there. And we can all empathise with that, particularly as we're in marking period. So, again, try and balance that feeling up that the staff felt they really wanted to provide good quality responses, but that took time. So, tweaks that we made for this academic year, and again, it's that reminder about keeping on innovating, isn't it? We altered the look of the cover sheet, again, something students have fed back on. They wanted it kind of more embedded within the university, so it looked more official, basically. So we did that. We also made it very clear that it was optional, because that was something that both students and staff had fed back. We introduced the cover sheet earlier. We included some more sort of signposting to it in taught sessions, also within the academic mentoring. And within that, we provided quite a lot more scaffolding about the sorts of questions that could be asked. And we provided some suggestions to staff about how they could respond, and particularly suggesting about maybe using the voice recording option in Turnitin, so that might make the written response aspect of it a little bit less onerous, that the cover sheet response could be provided that way. And a lot of staff have actually taken that up this year. So this research project happened last academic year. We've made these tweaks this year, and again, it's something we are constantly reflecting on. I presented this at a HEA feedback symposium. I got quite a lot of interest from other universities who've asked for materials and things. So it's been really interesting to see how that uptake broadens out. It'd be great if people were interested in trying it in other areas here at Staffordshire University as well. Something I'm currently working on is that aspect of, I think when we do these sorts of interventions, um, the students who are already engaged are probably the ones that benefit the most. And so I'm now kind of thinking about, what can we do to try and reduce some of those barriers, reach out to students who maybe are not as engaged with their assessment feedback. So yeah, any questions?